Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. First, tell us about yourself a little bit and how you found us and what we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm really stoked to be on here. This is it's very exciting for me. I became actually a fan of the podcast through everyone was. I'm involved with the Kabbalah in the UK, and we are. There's a lot of crossover between the people, the speakers, the subjects, a lot of the positions, and you guys kept coming up. And I ended up listening to a fair few of your episodes, and then I kind of got hooked. And then I sort of ran into, as you remember, we sort of ran into each other in some of the chats that go on around the sort of pupils and the sort of attendees of Habara sessions, and so we ended up having quite an interesting conversation about Kabbalah, and then I assume, and you ended up sort of like pointing me at some things that you were trying to get into the sort of Gnostic side of things, and I said, oh well, actually I do have a certain amount of background in that, because I spent a good deal of my past involved with Kabbalah, and so I mean I got into it in my sort of like mid to late 20s as part of becoming more Shomer Maswath. And part of this was because when I grew up in sort of UK reform, which is far more sort of Germanic, and I was sort of moving quite away from that. And one of the things that was bothering me was the lack of connection that I got with the lack of emotional connection, and the lack of a what you might call, I guess, what from people call ruchnius, right? And all the options that were being put in front of me at that point all had sort of black hats and like Hasidus attached to them. And I was fortunate enough to be involved in interreligious dialogue at the time. And as a result, I ended up meeting Sufis. And the Sufis were that was a very exciting conversation. I think many Jewish people have found Sufi conversations very exciting in the past. And that led to things like attending like Sufi dhikrs. So like the Zahor, it's like remembrance of God. They're chanting the names of God. There's music. It's as a musician, that sort of thing appeals to me. But at the same time, there was nothing going on there which I found dodgy. And even with hindsight, I don't find it dodgy. I mean, but part of what I was sort of looking for was this kind of more sort of intense emotional experience. And once I started looking within my own heritage for this, because my family are sort of Amsterdam on my father's side, and with a certain amount of Irish, and on my mother's side, Bombay Iraqi, so from Iraq and Kurdistan. And so I spent a lot of time on the musical side of that, and you kind of get Kabbalah that kind of goes along with this, and I got more and more into that, and I ended up spending like 25 years on it. And this was I mean, it was very rewarding in many ways, and I ended up finding a lot of very useful things, which I'll sort of come back to later, because because these are also the things which led me away from that path. And part of that was, in many ways, my own Rav, who is more of a sort of he's more of a Rav Kafi kind of guy, sending me more in the direction towards the sort of more Maimonidean traditions. And at the same time, because of some of the things that I was involved in the community, I ended up actually getting into a lot of fights, because I'm a bit of an activist on the quiet. So I ended up getting into fights with people like Yosef Mizrahi, right? And a lot of what I was objecting to fundamentally was the hellfire stuff, fear of, if you like, right? It's like, you don't listen to this, you're going to go to hell, there's going to be red hot pokers, all of this sort of stuff. And I'm just going, what the hell is this? Right? Why are we doing this? So you're trying to scare people into being religious. This isn't right. This isn't moderate. It's not what I think Judaism should be about. And the thing that really bothered me fundamentally was that when people tried to talk me out of these things, it was always because it says somewhere in Kabbalah or in the Zohar or big rabbis who are like adherents of Kabbalah said, who are you to disagree with these guys? And I was like, what do you mean, who am I to disagree with these guys? I mean, do we argue from authority? Have we got like infallibility now? Is this Catholicism that we have? And I came more and more to the conclusion that actually, when you looked at it, it kind of was. And the final straw was really when I sort of I kind of got I started to feel this is really antithetical to monotheism, right? You end up actually with some real issues, and there are other things that were sort of very contributory to that. For example, what happened with Chabad messianism and the way that people started talking about Rav Schneesen, right? And clearly all the problems that when people talk about, oh, Kabbalah is very dangerous, well, there we are. You can see that. You can see it being dangerous right now. You can see it driving all the wrong behaviors. You can see it actually breaching halakha, and that starts to be a real problem. So, but for me, the understanding this requires you to go back and think about, well, what's going on here? Where does Kabbalah really come from? And that's what takes us to Gnosticism, which was where you and I started really talking about this.
Well, so from our perspective, we really wanted to do a show. We're going to do a series of shows on the topic because it's fascinating and it's important. The kabbalistic works, for the most part, have been introduced pseudepigraphically, meaning, for those who don't understand what that means, it means that an author would use he would attribute the text to an ancient writer to give it kind of a credibility. Like most famously with the Zohar, it was put together by Moshe de Leon, who was a scribe, a professional copyist, actually, I should say, who lived a century after the Rambam died, and he wrote the Zohar in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So I was always intrigued by the fact, once I discovered this fact, I was always just intrigued by, okay, where is this coming from? How did this just appear? It seems to be kind of like an anti-Maimonidean response. And where do these texts kind of start? Because when you look into it, you start seeing that even in other religions, even in Christianity, there's something similar happening. And then it led me to understanding Gnosticism, what Gnosticism was. So, with you, I know you're kind of an expert in this field, so we wanted to have a conversation with you about this and just kind of give us the breakdown of how everything happened.
Okay, well, so first of all, I mean, I don't know if I'd call myself an expert. I think that's a big claim, but I have, spent a lot of time thinking about this and studying this myself. And I think if you want to understand the origins and the key concepts you have to start thinking about where Gnosticism comes from and how old it is.
And what it is. You also want to first and foremost define Gnosticism for the audience as well.
Okay, so what I would say is it is a view of the cosmos, where the universe comes from, what the divine is, what humans are, and the relation between humans and nature and the universe which takes a certain form, which comes from which is where it comes from originally. It's hard to say, but it's more about the approach that is taken. There's a certain sets of key concepts that keep coming up, and these are actually, in many cases, these are not necessarily, these are drawn out of the sort of ferment of different groups and sects and thinkers of late antiquity. I mean, there's some bits which are very Greek. A lot of it, you can center it in Alexandria, which is what makes it really interesting, because you've got Jews in Alexandria. It's a huge Jewish center. There's thinkers like Philo. You've got Greek thought coming in, which is already in sort of Jewish centers in Israel and everywhere else, which is driving different sects, like the people that Josephus is talking about. You've got people like the Essenes. You've got people like the sect that's in Qumran. You've got the people that are writing the Nag Hammadi texts. You've got the early Christians, the early church, drawn out of sort of like these miracle sects in Galilee. Now, it's not for me to say which version is correct, but I'm more interested in the content of it, and for me that comes down to the cosmogony, how things started, right? What God is, what the divine is, what the world is, what humans are, and therefore what we should do as a result, because that's where it starts to get really interesting, because that's what's potentially really in conflict with the way that we and I'm taking that, when I say we, what I'm talking about here is rabbinic Judaism, right? And that's the kind of baseline for me, the rabbinic Judaism of Chazal. And if you start with the sort of creation of the universe stuff, this is the key word here is emanation, right? And what I mean by that is a kind of gradual emergence of everything from some kind of divine source in stages, or the technical term for these is hypostases, from the higher to the lower, from the ineffable to the intellectually graspable.
Ishtalshalut.
Yeah, exactly right. And there's a load of different models for how this is done. Everyone's got their sort of favorite. It's a little bit like how everyone starts a while later, about 1,000 years later, everyone starts working out what the sort of fundamentals are, right? And what the sort of fundamental theological statements, the things that we've got to sign up for. But everyone's got a different model of how these stages emanate, right? Some guys are really keen on tetrads. Some guys are really keen on triads. It really depends on which tradition that you follow. But there's certain really important figures in here. And one of them is this guy called Plotinus, who's a 3rd century Egyptian Greek philosopher. And he is what considered to be when people talk about neo-Platonism, that's who they're talking about. Sometimes they're talking about Plato, but this really isn't Plato, as most people who understand Plato would understand it. It's this neo-Platonic idea. It's Plato plus, so it's Plato in the sense of world of forms, right? But it's that plus Persian ideas and Indian ideas. And all of this has somehow come together in this kind of way of thinking. And so there's a lot of arguments about what this
Zoroastrian. By Persian, do you mean Zoroastrian?
Yeah, I mean there are very definitely Zoroastrian influences in there, right? And this is where, first of all, you're going to get an issue, because Zoroastrianism is fundamentally dualistic. You've got the good and you've got the evil, right? And these are, yin yang. I don't know, but that's probably not the right concept to use. But it's more like, it's actually more easy, best to understand it as like the dark side of the force and the force, right? And how the universe is made up between these sort of two different beings, right? And this tells us something about how evil is seen as baked into the universe, but somehow not, it's somehow opposed to the divine. Like it's like God and the devil.
Yes.
Right? It's like as if these
there's a dualism.
There's a dualism, exactly. And part of the structure of the universe, part of it is that you're also talking about a view of the universe which is fundamentally based on the Ptolemaic view of spheres in a sort of concentric circles, which it remained respectable up until the sort of like the sort of Middle Ages or the late Middle Ages. But what is imposed by that is this idea of a natural hierarchy. So the universe is made up of energy, and it's made up of celestial bodies, and it's made up of different things that go closer and further away from where we as humans live in this kind of world, in this very sort of lower world, right? But within it, right, the universe is kind of this timeless Aristotelian eternal process of unfolding. Right now, so far so good. This is kind of where those guys are coming from. But when it starts to get interesting once you start looking at the nature of God. Now, Gnostics believe the material realm that we live in to be the result of a fall. Right? Somehow a divine principle has become perverted. Right? And this divine principle is called Sophia, or wisdom. And the offspring of this is what they call the demiurge, right? And this starts to go quite bad for us in Alexandria because Greeks and Jews are at odds. They're not friends. They're not getting on. And the Christians are arriving, and they're also not that happy with Judaism. They're not that happy with Jews. There's bad blood that goes back to Philo, and what is decided by the Gnostics is that this demiurge is somehow identical with the God of the Old Testament, right? Our God, God, right? And this becomes bound up with the idea that you have to reject the Jewish God, right? Because the Jewish God is this kind of like lower form of the God that isn't really God, right?
They appropriated the concept in order to kind of reject Judaism through it.
Yeah, I think it serves on one level, it serves a political purpose, right? It's like philosophy pressed into the service of politics, right? So when you get Christian Gnostics in the same sort of environment, you're going to get a convergence of views. Now, this isn't like a sort of scholarly way of seeing it, but you can see how these people start conflating some very similar views, and you can see how that would happen.
It's very, we do it all the time. Like you'll see, like, you know, when someone doesn't like a certain person or a certain viewpoint, they'll say that's a sitra achra.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. Yeah. So it's the same idea here. You're taking the concept and you're sort of projecting it onto whatever within a context that you're comfortable with, right? That's what people do all the time. They take concepts and they put it where they see fit, essentially.
So what happens therefore is that you end up with this idea that the world is therefore like evil to some degree. We live in this kind of evil world, right, which is controlled by this demiurge, and if you're sensible, you'll think about you'll try and get beyond that to the reality, to truth, right? And you know, and the idea is, how do you become a person that transcends this view of the world? How do you develop as a human? And then you have to start thinking, well, what do Gnostics think humans actually are, right? Well, the reason humans can overcome this evil world and this demiurge is that we are actually, as humans, we are part of the divine ourselves. The human soul is a piece of the divine that somehow fell from the higher worlds and got trapped in the physical, right? And it is within our power to rejoin and ascend through this cosmic hierarchy that I mentioned before via various types of exercises. Now, these could be personal virtue, these can be mental exercises, spiritual exercises, sexual practices, ritual practices, right? Magic is what starts to be important here.
So when is the earliest that we see this? Because the idea here is that there's a piece of God inside humans, right? Stuck, at least within humans. So the connection with Kabbalah and the idea of Chelek Elokim Mimal, obviously, it's undeniable. Question is, when is the earliest that we see this concept brought in? When how far back does this concept appear?
So I actually think it's easier to track it through a different concept. And the concept that I would pick is this idea of how you become an enlightened being. Because what you really need for this is a teacher. You need a teacher of righteousness, right? Somebody who's your spiritual guide to the higher worlds that you can utterly trust, because this guy is an adept, right? He knows everything that you need. You must trust him, right? He's your guide in the coming war, or in the war between the dark side and the light side. So there's also, whenever you see apocalyptic kind of visions of this, like for example in the scroll with the Dead Sea sect, where they have that they describe that sort of war between the darkness and light, they have their own teacher of righteousness, right? There's people, whenever you get people talking about being the warriors of light, there's that's where you can immediately start dating that kind of idea of when things happen. Now, the question is, are there any really Jewish elements of this? And because we can see the Babylonian bits, we can see the sort of Christian bits, we can see the sort of Egyptian bits, we can see the Greek bits. You know, the clearest Jewish element of this is what is referred to as Merkabah, mysticism.
Kabbalah literature.
Yeah. So this starts with this idea of, you know, the vision of the chariot that Yehezkel had, which is a very recondite section of Nach, right? You've got a lot of very, very complex imagery. You've got Ofanim, whatever, those are Hayot. You've got Bazak going backwards and forwards, running and returning. You've got a lot of this very heavily coded literature, and now's not the time to go into all of that. But you've got a set of signs that need to be interpreted, right? And you can make mistakes when you're interpreting these things. That bit, very, very Jewish, right? So hang on to that for a minute, right? But you also have this at the same time, as part of the Merkabah literature, you have the Hechalot literature, like things like Hechalot Rabbati, you know, the Hebrew book of Enoch. You know, you've got Sefer Hechalot, and these are actually explicitly attributed to people like Rabbi Akiba, Rabbi Ishmael, but they're not halachic works. They're works of wisdom. They are visions of the seven heavens, right? You know, this is where we get the idea of the seven heavens, and these are described as seven palaces, seven Hechalot. But what you get in these texts is this idea of a series of rooms in a palace, and you go further and further towards this inner mystery and direct contact with the divine. It's a mystical quest. It's a journey. But I should say straight away, this is not like the journey that we see later on in Maimonides' parable of the palace. This is not something about a philosophy. Right? To proceed through on this mystical quest, you need the right stuff. You need a guide. You need the right incantations. You need the sigils. You need the codes. You need the right angelic names to unlock the right to get past the guardians at the threshold. This is more like Harry Potter than anything else, right? It's a mystical quest. You know, sometimes, you know, you've got to answer the right riddles. You know, and what you will also see as part of this, as you navigate through the palace, you'll come across the divine council, right? Now, so you'll, as you speak with angels, the angels are part of a divine council, and they sort of get together and they contemplate things, and you can actually gain control of these angels and bend them to your will. This is also starts to be immediately problematic, right? And the most important work that actually persists out of this until later is the Shir Koma, right? And this is again a very peculiar work. I mean, this is, if you like, a description of the actual dimensions and measurements of the body of God, right? I mean, astounding piece of work, right? So they start with, the sole of God's feet is 160 squillion parasangs wide, and you can kind of see what they're doing there. They're trying to like destroy your concepts of human measurements, right? This is so much bigger than you could possibly imagine. We're going to break your brain by making you think about it, right? But effectively, you've got this, it's bigger than you could imagine, but fundamentally, this is kind of still quite a human-shaped thing that's being described, right? It's corporealism in a sort of weird way. But this is nonetheless, this is something that's coming out of our culture. So you've got the Hechalot, you've got the Merkavah stuff, but it's not really the Judaism that we would expect to see coming out of the rabbinic tradition. When someone like Yochanan ben Zakkai talks about Maaseh Merkabah, it's not remotely clear that he means the same thing that the Merkabah mystics talk about. There are a few things where you can go, that's a very interesting. Why do they say Yored? Why do you descend to the Merkabah? Right? It's very different. In the Hechalot literature, you ascend through mystical journeys. This is very different, right? When we have a sort of a bona fide like thing that makes it into the Talmud, right? The four who journey to Pardes, right? It's very different. It doesn't tell you exactly what's in the Pardes, right? It's a very different journey, right? It's firstly, each one of the four of them takes a different approach. One of them, it goes really wrong. Or in fact, three of them goes really wrong, right? Only one of them gets in and out safely. And all that is really talked about technically within the Mishnah and the Gemara about this, whatever this approach is, right, is just what we call it the Rashi Parakim, the heads of chapters, right? You have to show that you are qualified to get into this stuff. This is a very different picture of rabbinic mysticism, right? It's got nothing to do with this kind of more neo-Platonic or Gnostic approach. It's just there's no similarity to my mind. There's no similarity in the language. It's the mistakes that you can make is in interpreting the signs wrong. So this is why when
there are actually many scholars who will point to the Elisha ben Abuya part of the story as a criticism of Gnosticism, because he becomes kind of a dualist through this process. He has the wrong
100%. Yeah. And and there's the warnings are built in. When you see this thing, don't think this is marble. This is right. Mime, all of these things. That it's a warning about doing this in the wrong way when you're not qualified. It's not don't do it if you haven't got the right teacher. You have to apply to somebody who does know this, right? And you have to sort of like pass the exam to be qualified to expound on these matters, right? It's taken very seriously, right? So, yeah. So why is this bad, right? So we've talked about dualism, right? We can see that it actually is originally linked to criticism of Christianity, of Judaism, of criticism of the God of the Old Testament, as Christians would call it, right? And there are some other sort of really important key concepts that go along with it, right? There is So there's rejecting the God of the Old Testament for the New Testament. There is law versus love, right? And this is very familiar to us from the New Testament. You know, the law is dead. You know, it's a testament. That's what you get when you die, right? Right? The world is evil, right? And the only way to escape from the evil of the world is by focusing on what's fundamentally important underneath, right? The law in particular is evil, gets in the way of the good. It gets in the way of accessing the divine. The only person who can actually get you to this is this teacher of righteousness, right? And so what you really want to do is join his elite group of disciples. You can see already how by the time that the New Testament is actually written, like 400 years after Jesus actually died, by people who didn't know him, right? They're using this model, right? They're not using the model of like Jesus's brother James and the early Christians, who are basically Jews and basically still keeping, you know, kashrut and washing before meals and Shabbat and so forth, right? This is a different set of people. There's a different approach. These guys are following their teacher. They're following without question, even when it's weird and hard to explain. It's like the David Koresh model, right?
Yeah. It creates a cult kind of system, a hierarchy, a vertical society.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's inherently vertical. And yeah, and you know, that happens very early, even with the Jewish sects, like the Qumran sect. This is what they've done as well. You know, you accept the teacher's direction without question, even when it goes against what you think you know, right? And it's ironic, therefore, that Gnosticism then becomes uncomfortable once the church actually gains temporal power, right? And this is where the bishop that we started on talking about, Gnosticism is not comfortable with institutions, right? They want to focus on what Gnosticism takes you to is the one guy that's really got the truth, right? And everything else is like, that's the inner truth of what's important. Everything else is structure. Now you can see how this starts to be a real problem. Sorry?
The pneumiut. It's like the real, right? Just to borrow a kabbalistic term.
Well, yeah, and these terms are immediately adopted. Yeah. So, you know, the church is in power. It's very uncomfortable with things that it sees as antinomian, right? And like you say, this is I think Gershom Scholem was one of the first people to say this. It's like, this is essentially the worldview that underpins the Kabbalah of the Zohar in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And even more so of the particular view of the Zohar that is prevalent now, and that is via the Kabbalah of the Ari. And we must remember that when we say it's the Kabbalah of the Ari, it's the Kabbalah of Chaim Vital.
Yeah.
Right? He's reporting what has been said. It's his version of events. Obviously, there are other schools of Zohar, like the Ramak, right? But you look at what ends up in Lurianic Kabbalah, and I know this is a jump ahead, right? But it's conceptually very similar. There's sparks trapped in the world. There's cosmic evil. This is Klipat Noga, right? The sparks, this sort of mixed world of good and evil. The world is in a fallen state, and it's our job to make tikkun, to repair.
There's also a like higher deity and a lesser deity. You know, the same concepts in Gnosticism.
Yeah, the Partsufim.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you need to understand these. You need to understand the structure of God and the interface between God and the world. And the point of this is therefore that you can then end up by being able to influence God by acting in the world, right? Yeah. So you can, when you're carrying out an act you're carrying out a maswa, you're actually carrying out a mystical act that fixes the universe, right? So we've got Tu B'Shvat coming up, right? You've got, that turns into, instead of being, you know, taxia for trees, right? That turns into, you've got to eat 4 different types of fruit, one for each of the worlds, And
there's divinity trapped in the klipa, and it's our job to kind of through the mitzvot we're releasing God from his shackles, basically, because he's trapped in this world, and we need to reunite him with the original source, which is already a dualistic idea, but that's precisely it.
I want to clarify for the audience, because I have a feeling that some people are hearing the word dualism and they're like, what do you mean? But I don't believe in two gods or any dualistic God. I believe in one Hashem. Can we clarify what we mean here by dualism in a way that, because I think that people might not realize what we really mean when we say dualistic. It does not necessarily mean two separate gods, but how can you explain how that would be? So I want the listeners to understand what we mean when we say dualism.
So, I mean, there's a dualism of good and evil. I think that's the fundamental dualism that we're talking about. And we're talking about evil that almost that is not part of God, that is separate, right? And, our texts say, Oseh Hara, right? So in Isaiah, God says, I make everything, I do everything, everything is me, right? We are fundamentally about a unified position here, right? If you say that evil doesn't come from God, or it comes from a sort of subsidiary part of God that isn't really God anymore, right? That is dualistic. I actually think it's a bigger problem than dualism, to be honest.
You're referring to the idea of klipa.
Klipa is more of that's more about the sort of the understanding how operationally that comes about, right? The thing that you have to understand is that you can't directly touch the Ein Sof. You have to proceed through these different stages, these hypostases. The problem isn't dualism. It's actually that you have a decad. You have 10 stages that you work through.
Multiplex Godhead.
Exactly.
It's not a simple unity.
Yeah, it's a set of interfaces, and you start actually not thinking of these as interfaces. These are actually modalities which are almost like avatars of God, right? So that's even worse, right? You start getting avatars of God, then you're going to start immediately getting people who are actually, it's only one step from God having avatars which are the parts of him, to people like teachers of righteousness embodying those avatars in some way. It's not a massive step.
We have that already.
Oh yeah.
Yep, we have that a lot.
No, that defines like
the concept of the tzaddik. That's what it is. Yeah.
That's exactly where that is.
Yep.
Yeah. And so and for me, actually, the hypostases of here, these kind of interfaces that we have in our texts, like the Sephirot, that if you don't understand them that way, they're not nearly as problematic, right? I mean, they're much that you can use them to describe humans and human created things, right? Maaseh Bereshith rather than Maaseh Merkavah, right? But they're not going to tell you anything about God or the universe, right? They're not going to tell you how to observe the law, and they most certainly are not 10 special levers that you can pull to get God to do things, right? Nor do they describe God directly, right? This is the problem with all of these theosophical approaches to God. Effectively, they are actually androcentric. They are anthropomorphic, right? They're human-shaped, right? Anytime you see somebody explaining God in the shape of a human, there's going to be a problem, right? That's far worse than dualism, right? I think, I forget who it was. Someone will remind me, but it's the thing that, there we are. The guy goes, was it him? He said, whoever it was that said, oh, the Christians are 3, but the Kabbalists have 10.
Yeah, I believe it was him, if I'm not mistaken.
No,
it wasn't.
No, do you know what? It was.
That was
De Modena.
I'm not sure. It wasn't him either.
It was in a.
It was a Rishon.
It was a Rishon. I forgot the name. Not those.
Well,
two.
It's in your conversation with Yaakov Dweck, which I thought was terrific. Yeah, he talks about this. It's tremendous, right? And so two's bad enough. 3's even worse. 10, what are you going to do with 10? Right? And then you put the 10 together and you get some sort of like conceptual human being, right? With a head and legs and, you know, and genitals and legs and kidneys and all this sort of thing. And you kind of go, what have we built here? We've built a huge super, like a universe shaped human, right? And it's,
we're creating God in the image of man instead of man in the image of God.
So how would you answer when someone says, right, but we're not actually describing God. These are just the terms that we use for lack of better terminology, and we're talking in terms of how we are able to process, but it's not really talking about. What would you say about that?
Seder Hishtalshalut. It's the idea that it's just from our perspective. It's not actually God.
Correct. Yeah. So a lot of people I've noticed will just straight away go with, no, we don't actually mean that. It's just it's a frame of reference. It's a way of we're talking the language of man. We don't mean it literally. Or what would you say to that?
So what I would say is, look at what people are actually doing practically, what decisions people make, right? If that's true, then why is it so terrible? Why is there such a terrible penalty for getting things wrong? Right? Why is it that people are why is it that you will end up going, if I switch this light on Shabbat, I'm going to break the universe? Right? This terrible, this is where this kind of terrible OCD thing comes from, where people are being told that what they do, even on the smallest level, can have this effect on the universe. Why if that's true, why wouldn't you be terribly concerned? We're on Tu B'Shvat, when you eat your fruit which has the right sort of peel on it to affect the world of Yetzirah, right? You'd better make sure you're peeling your lychee correctly, right? I mean, the problem for me is that it causes people to act in to overstate their own importance.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And they're doing this on the say-so of someone else who they end up having to overstate the importance of. At the end of the day, you end up over-reliance on your heroic teacher guide.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
that's the only way forward. That's the only way forward.
And even from a perspective of the Seder Hishtalshalut, which tries to like kind of sanitize that idea, there's still a meeting point between God and man, and I think it's in Keter, right? There's like that has to be explained, because there's still this like kind of blurring of the lines between humanity and divinity.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, something I think you've said to me in the past is this idea that we're part of God and God is everything. This kind of panentheistic idea that you end up with, it ends up becoming very egotistical, right? Very self-serving for people to get the idea that they're a piece of God, right? On one hand, it ought to make you treat each other, with extra respect. You're a piece of God, I'm a piece of God. I'm going to bow to the God in you, you're going to bow to the God in me, all of this sort of thing. But actually, what you really end up with is people thinking, oh, well, humans are far more are something that they're not, and that for me is the issue, and the amount of trouble this causes, right? And this causes terrible trouble for us. It causes terrible trouble for us during the Middle Ages. It causes terrible trouble for the Christians, actually. But part of that is because they take a very dim view of anybody disagreeing with the sort of power structures, and this is how you end up with these sort of crusades in the 13th century.
I think Rambam says it best in Hilchot Avodat Kochavim, where he discusses Dor Enosh, and basically that's that way of thinking what it leads to. If you, it's clear as day. Maybe you can elaborate on this idea, because it's really just, you see that the hierarchical structure of, there are these people. For those who don't know, in Dor Enosh, there was he explains how Avodah Zarah, how idolatry came to be. And basically what it is that it lends itself to like a corruptibility where it leads to like cult thinking and leaders who take advantage of others who aren't in the know, right? Who say that I have this specific, I see that, this deity over there, this pagan deity, I actually know what he looks like because I'm in, I have some type of connection to him, and I, this statue that I built is actually a representation of that. It's not actually the god, but it's representation. And if you pay tribute to it, it's as if you're paying a tribute to the gods, and then it leads to kind of it trickles down to every person, and that's kind of how paganism came to be.
It leads to total dependency always.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing that I always really took out of that conversation of the Rambam was that you end up actually thinking that you have much more control than you do. You end up mistaking I think I've heard someone else saying this. You're mistaking the signified for the signifier. This statue actually has power instead of being there to concentrate your thoughts, right? It's a construct, but somehow you can control it, and then you can control God, and that's going to be, that's where you get real issues, right? It's theurgical, it's propitiatory.
Well, the key point with the Rambam is he's saying that like they erred, like the Enosh and his generation, they erred. He's actually giving them the benefit of the doubt. He's saying that they meant well, and it's the same thing people will say. But how can you say all these like great Kabbalists and how can they be wrong? It's the same kind of argument. Like people can make mistakes. We bring a korban. The priest brings a korban hatat for the mistakes made by the leaders of Am Yisrael, right? And it happens, right? Even the greatest people make mistakes, and then that can trickle down and kind of lead to like a domino effect of problems.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. So it discourages the intellect in favor of this kind of emotional attachment and your spiritual feelings, right? There's nothing provable about this. I mean, I will always remember a conversation I had once with somebody where they were telling me about how terrible it was to listen to Jewish music because it'll harm your neshama, right? And I was like, well, how do you measure that? Right? Who's got a neshamometer? Right? We've just had a thing over here where one of the Bate Din was saying to the people, to some of the Haredi communities, oh, you can't go to this concert by these two female singers, right? Because it's going to cause you spiritual harm. And these are two I don't know these singers myself, but these are two singers. They are very observant women. They wear shaitels. They do women only concerts, right? It's as kosher as it can be, but somehow that's still a problem, right? You can always point to some kind of inchoate spiritual harm, right? And who says there's this spiritual harm and how big this spiritual harm is? Well, this big rabbi says it is. Right? The master teacher told you this is bad. You got to follow them without question because of the consequences of getting it wrong.
That's why the faith narrative is highly enunciated. Faith. There's a reason why faith is always being thrown in, because dependence is exactly what makes the wheel turn over here. You have to have faith, and you have to essentially be totally dependent and not have any thoughts of your own whatsoever. You're living a faith-based, very dependent lifestyle, which is not involved. You're not using any of your. There's no independence. There's no. You're not encouraged to think for yourself in any capacity. Which you're
kind of trapped in this framework.
Yeah,
you can't go beyond that framework, and it's very much reflective, like you said, of the church, and how things were. So you have to just have faith. You're not allowed to question things.
The Pope says,
yeah.
And it's ironic, really, because when you look at how these when you look at how the mystical quest played out, mystical groups played out during the Renaissance, right? How it developed in the Western tradition, and as well as in Islamic traditions, right? This kind of idea of inner versus outer, esoteric versus exoteric, hidden reality. This keeps happening. The Christian Kabbalists, who you end up with in the sort of middle of the Renaissance, they study our text, they work with rabbis, and they come across the same concepts and they come to the same conclusions. As above, so below.
Yes.
Right. And this gets a lot of them like burnt as, like Pico della Mirandola, who's really important in this. He nearly gets burnt as a heretic.
Yeah, he's
right?
the greatest. I think he was the greatest collector of Kabbalistic literature in history. He's non-Jewish.
Yeah.
People,
yeah, but he only got out of it because he was protected by Lorenzo de Medici.
Yeah.
Right. And by Pope Alexander VI. Right. Eventually, by the way, he actually moved away from that. But who he moved away from was to Friar Savonarola in Florence, when everyone went completely sort of like bonfire of the vanities.
Yeah, he was quite a personality, that guy.
Yeah,
brutal.
And in the Islamic side of things, you go there are very similar sort of approaches. What you end up with is people like Al-Ghazali, who you see at the same time as Rambam. He argues with Ibn Sina, Avicenna, as he's known. There's a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and he's actually criticizing essentially a neo-Platonic position, but he ends up with ideas of this thing that they call the Alam al-Mithal, right, the world of images, right, and this is something that ends up as a really central doctrine for the 12 Shias, the mainstream Shia, and this is picked up by somebody important like Mullah Sadra, and that's the guy that Ayatollah Khomeini. That's the school that he comes from, right? Spiritual exercises, a process of this pursuit of wisdom, which where your goal is to acquire wisdom and become this kind of godlike sage. And guess how that played out in Khomeini's doctrine of government by the clergy.
Right.
So this is not the way that Jews and Sufis have sort of have worked together. This is not what Avraham ben Rambam ends up doing. It's a very different model.
Yeah, I think we can also maybe clarify, because what some people will say is that, like those who say like the Rambam was a secret Kabbalist, they'll point to the fact that the 10 angels, right? The whole it kind of sounds similar. There's emanation. It sounds similar to the Sefirot, but it's obviously not the same thing. Angels are created beings or forces of nature, and the emanation does not happen before creation, like in the Godhead, like it happens in Kabbalah. This is talking about something completely different. So maybe you can kind of clarify what you just said with Avraham ben Rambam and Sufism and Rambam's view versus the Kabbalistic view.
So what I would say is this. Firstly, it's the easiest thing in the world to claim that somebody really would have agreed with X, Y, and Z view, like after they're dead. And a lot of people are trying to do this because if you can get Rambam in the Kabbalistic camp, then happy days, right? You've got everyone lined up. You've got no more arguments, right? And so lots of people try and claim that. I think the difference is that working on yourself as an intellectual discipline and as a philosophical discipline it's about descending into yourself and actually working through the philosophical difficulties that you come across, right? And when you think you've got it right, then you can go and check with somebody who's like a qualified teacher in this, right? It is a completely different approach from saying, well, no, there's a set way that you progress through this, and you actually have to follow the program that's set out by this particular teacher, right? It's more like, it's the difference between follow this particular methodology and you'll get to the answer, to work it out for yourself and then come back and check if you've gone wrong. Right? It's a difference between relying on your own training and thinking, and relying again on a guide who you have to trust to not make a mistake. Right? And it's a problem, you know. So what you so
well I actually think that it's important also for us to mention, you know, Rambam the mystic, because he, you know, that's another misunderstanding people have, that he was a philosopher, an anti-mystic philosopher. We recently did a podcast with Menachem Kellner, and we referenced, you know, Chacham Fa'ur's work Homo Mysticus, where he describes the process of that. There is a mysticism in Judaism, of course, and the Ma'aseh Merkavah procedure that he describes is nothing similar to the Kabbalistic ideas that we have today, which is like you know, a student would have to give kind of an oral sermon in front of his teacher, and if he passed, he became kind of the quote unquote, the term wasn't used back then, but mekubal, right? He became a master of the secrets, or the understanding of this, you know, the deeper ideas within Judaism. But it's not this idea of like understanding the Godhead in order to kind of manipulate the system and trying to understand what God is, because clearly from our tradition we see, even from that story of that you mentioned in Pardes with Rabbi Akiva, he escapes because he kind of puts his head down, right? He doesn't engage in it because he's not worthy of it. And there's a certain limit. We're constantly taught this. Even Moshe Rabbeinu, right, he sees the burning bush and he turns away. There's this idea that there's a point where humanity cannot ever understand the divine. There's a boundary, right? This is actually represented through symbolism in the Beit HaMikdash with the curtain between the Holy of Holies and the Kohen Gadol, where the curtain represents this boundary between, you know, the God who is completely transcendent and humanity. So there's that, you know, which I think is an important distinction to make.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on. I mean, I think Chacham Fa'ur's book is tremendous for the way it actually lays out those differences. I would certainly recommend that to anybody. The thing I would really point to is that the difference between the sort of mystical approach that I understand the Rambam to be following and the sort of Kabbalistic approach is that you don't get out of the rabbinic approach, you don't get a detailed description of content, right? People do not tell you, you know, if I go and I sort of manage to sort of succeed to go to have this Pardes experience and to lecture on it to my to lecture it on my teacher, and my teacher goes, yeah, you've got it. I don't then go out and write a book about it, right? I don't write what happens in Kabbalah is people write their own accounts of what they think is going on,
and it's no longer a subjective experience. Now
exactly,
it becomes an objective.
That's the reality.
Yes. So now you're looking at a piece of paper that says, this is the objective reality. This is exactly how God functions. Even if you want to look at the metaphor, it's a problem because it's not, you know, it's no longer a subjective, a kind of oral presentation, but now it becomes this kind of like map, right? It's a map for God.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's exactly the problem. So, yeah.
So I actually want to read a quote, which I really like, from Paul Johnson in the History of the Jews. He says this, he says, Gnosticism, or the lore of secret knowledge systems, is an extremely insidious, parasitic growth, which attaches itself like a poisonous ivy to the healthy trunk of a major religion. In Christianity, the early church fathers had to fight desperately to prevent it from smothering the faith. It attacked Judaism too, especially in the diaspora. So I want to know your thoughts on this statement.
Well, I guess you can hear me sort of laughing slightly. Part of this is that, well, I think there is a very, the problem is that from my, and I'm not saying being anti-Christian here, but the fact is, Christianity is based on this idea of a teacher of righteousness, right? And the major figures from Jesus through to Paul are people that you follow without question. The question is,
well, they're saints. That's why. Well, that's the major difference between Judaism and Christianity, is that we don't have, like, the Torah goes out of its way to point out the flaws of all of our people. Like, don't forget they're human, right? Moshe, we don't know where he's buried. Don't forget, like, he's not, we're not going to turn him into, like, we're not going to turn this into a shrine for worship. The Torah is constantly making this checks and balance system to understand that even the greatest of our leaders were human beings. And Christianity kind of does the opposite, where these people, if they're divine and they're perfect and they're saints, they can never be questioned. And that's it. It ends with them, right? They're the end all be all.
Yeah. And the approach in the church to this, right, from the very early stages, they have a big conference to actually discuss which theological positions are correct and incorrect. And that's what goes into creeds, right? And if you're at the conference, you argue your point of view and you end up in the wrong point. Let's say you're like Arius and you end up, and your Arianism ends up becoming declared heresy. Then if you're an Arian, then you're in trouble now, because the official council which decides what is inside or outside the camp, right, has taken a position against you. You're in trouble now, right? And that remains the problem, because that's the way that the church deals with everything throughout not only the ancient world, but all the way up to, in many ways, up to common times. Like, you have people like Giordano Bruno, who is a major figure in the sort of like the medieval Christian church. He gets burnt because he ends up like he is at the wrong place, right? You've got other people who become seen as very disreputable because they start to be associated with they're seen with the wrong people, right? This is one of the things that happens in one of the guy I like to point out here is the famous Elizabethan wizard John Dee. He was he's a wizard. He was also, he worked for Queen Elizabeth I in her secret service. He was in Bohemia, right, at the same time, just before the arrival of the Maharal, right? This is a guy that's having conversations with angels who are giving him a completely new language. It's the sort of thing, it's going to give the church conniptions, right? And the antinomianism is what really worries the church, because it's something they can't control. Now, I believe actually we have a very different problem, right? Because what has happened for us in the modern era is a particular modality of belief has a modality of Judaism has come to be what we have centered on, right? Which is, and unfortunately for us, it requires the centering of the creating of this sort of hero sage, right? Who we then end up treating in a pagan way, right? I mean, in much the same way that, so we had a problem when the problem was clearly visible when we saw what happened with Shabbetai Ẓevi.
Yeah.
Right. This is a guy who used everyone got very complicated with everyone got very comfortable with the idea of Kabbalah being a sort of secret wisdom, and that Mekubalim really knew what they were talking about, and you could really sort of rely on them. And so once you get somebody who has the sort of magic beard, right, he has the sort of special hat that, you know, he becomes the one that everyone's listening to. What he then does, he has the most enormous amount of power to influence everybody, right? And then nearly the whole Jewish world ends up following this guy, and then he ends up converting to Islam, right? Which is a huge problem. Everyone like bet on this guy. People were selling their businesses, selling their homes, wanting to move to Eretz Yisrael because Mashiach is here. All of this, and suddenly Mashiach has now, you know, it's worse than died. He's become a Muslim. What the hell do we do with that?
Yeah.
Right.
And because Islam has, you know, it's monotheistic, so it has a, you know, kedusha in it. He's just raising the sparks, right?
That's the fallback story.
Yeah, that's the fallback, not just the fallback story, but it actually creates more problems, because here now the Kabbalah kind of becomes the weapon that's used to kind of make all these bad ideas justifiable.
Yeah, it's desperate post hoc rationalization is being used here, right? You've got, you know, you have to justify the heroic teacher sage even after his death, right? Like they do with Jesus. Oh, he didn't really die, right? Or like with certain other rabbis, oh, he's not really dead, right? Like the hidden imam, right? You know, he's out there, he's hidden, he's instructing the faithful, right? And Shabbetai Ẓevi is another version of this. It's mystical apostasy, right? He'll be back one day to fix everything. I mean, this isn't Judaism. This is like King Arthur. It's the same thing, right? This is the problem with magical thinking, and the thing that for us now is the biggest problem, that this idea of magical thinking and infallible teachers and sages. This is how people think now about the leaders of who are the people that are considered the leaders of the Jewish world, right? These like great rabbis, these Gadolim, right? The people at the top of what I very rudely refer to as the yeshiva industrial complex, right? They've gained control of the levers of power, like they have in Catholicism, right? And what has happened is we have recreated that entire structure. All those bad decisions, bad, like, you know, the convergent evolution has caused us to recreate all the same things that were a problem in like medieval Catholicism. You know, we've got relics, we've got magic, we've got indulgences, right? We've got dynastic succession.
Right. That's not
right.
And the thing is, when you know, the super culture or the oppressor, you know, when the oppressor kind of has a, you know, a long period of power over the oppressed, inevitably the oppressed will kind of adopt some of those kind of ideas. They'll see reality through that prism. You know, they'll even have an effect on the oppressor as well. But I find it's a very fascinating thing that happens. You know, we see it we did an episode on Yehuda Chassid and Sefer Chassid, where people don't know this, but a lot of the weird and crazy ideas that are revolving death in the modern understanding of Jews today comes from this book. And we broke down just historically. There's absolute evidence to show that these were local Christian ideas that kind of permeated into everyday Jewish life. It's actually from a very local town in Germany. And there's a record that shows that these ideas come from there.
Right. It's not just general, it's highly specific.
So we can't really blame the Jews, because the exile was so harsh. And obviously when we say rabbis, the institution of rabbis, we're not saying all rabbis are bad, but we're talking about, for those who want us to be more clear, we're talking about this Das Torah kind of quote unquote Gadolatry, as it's known, where, you know, there's this dynamic between the sages or the rabbis and the people, where they cannot be questioned. We have to shut off our brain. Any movement that leads to telling the people don't use your mind, be simple. Like I had, I hate to have to use a group, but like Breslov Hasidut is very similar to this. It's the idea that only through the teachings of Rabbi Nachman, or only through Rabbi Nachman, can you actually receive
that's shituf.
Yes.
All right, it's problem, and you get the same pattern emerging there, because these are associated ideas that, there are certain things that they're obsessed about, right? And and they just over focus on these particular acts or areas.
Sexuality, a lot of times.
Well, yeah, I wasn't going to be too explicit about it, but they're very obsessed about certain things. Right. And it's like, well, why are you so obsessed about this? What's so bad about it? Well, there's like millions of demons, right? Yeah. Demons everywhere. You're creating demons, spraying demons in every direction, right? And, and if you want, and this is where, so this is like, we're like doing Yaron Reuven here now. And, this is, why are we worried about like creating demons? Why, we should be thinking, we've moved a really long way away from keeping the law and our obligations under the law, right? There are the things, you mentioned earlier that Torah. I would say there's actually, let me be really clear about this. There are three key things that I think underpin this way of thinking, right? One of which is this idea of Yerida Hadorah. Now, I don't mean the reputable version of this, right? The one that says, oh no, those guys knew more than this because they learnt from these teachers, and you can track the Mesorah and the transition of one school to another. I mean the idea that a generation is inherently more sinful or less capable than the other. The fall of man, right? This is a Gnostic idea, right? Humans are less than they were in the past. Right. The second one is the one that goes with this, is this idea of madrigot, of levels. Whenever you hear somebody saying, oh, I'm not on the level of so-and-so, I can't, oh, he can say that, but I can't. Right. Oh, and there's, I'm not on that madriga. Right. When people talk about that, they are saying that humans have different, that there's a type of superhuman that's on a higher level that you can't question.
Degrees of godliness.
Yeah, and that Torah is the worst of it, because it goes one step further to go, oh, you are, because of your level of perfection, which is conferred by your, studying Gemara for 90,000 years. Not that I'm saying anything against Gemara study. Everyone should study Gemara, but this qualifies you to give medical advice, right? And and say that coronavirus can be dealt with by Torah study and every other sort of mad thing against it.
Maybe the kuf is smudged in the mezuzah as Mordechai Yemini said.
Yeah, and this is where you get, every time you have one of these people, and I'm afraid to say this, but this is where Kirov starts to get to be a really big problem, because you have people saying, oh well, I'm not saying it's bad, Kirov is bad because people are trying to keep the Mitzvot. Of course, people should keep the Mitzvot, people should keep Shabbat. That would be great. What I'm objecting to is people going, oh, there's on 9/11, there's a bunch of people, they didn't go to the office because they were saying silly horse, and therefore they didn't get hit. And they're thinking, oh my God, what are you telling people?
Yeah,
it's that you can that Judaism is like it's like a sort of like magical comforter. It's like a life jacket. It's like
an alternate reality. Actually, that's really what's going on. People, people are being subjected to this alternate reality, to see the world in a way that's not reality, in a sense.
Yes, Gnosticism is that idea, and Kabbalah, it's the idea that what you see is not there.
Yeah,
it's not
everything in this world actually has a spiritual underpinning that's sort of puppeteering all the events and actions that are going on in the world.
Yeah, the hidden
break from reality.
All of this. Yeah,
it's a break from reality.
And Kabbalah is that it becomes then this the most powerful tool in the armory of people who are trying to sell this thing. It's snake oil, right? You can go, oh, you too can actually access this amazing, authentic thing. Just come along to our sort of course. We'll send you to Israel, right, or whatever it is, right? And what people are really trying to do is that it's, let's make sure people, Jews marry other Jews. Well, that's great. We don't want people to marry out, all of that sort of thing. Great. But actually, it's what brings in the punters, right? The punters. Do you guys say punters? And you don't. That's a British thing, isn't it? Like that. It's like it gets bums on seats. That's also a British thing, isn't it? It gets the customers in. I don't know what you guys would say.
Yeah. It brings in the kind of, I guess you're saying like the degenerates, maybe, or I don't know.
No. I wouldn't know. I would say it's like, it's a way to get the rubes into the tent. How about that?
Oh, I see. Okay. All right.
Right. So yeah. So what you end up with is this, edifice of Gadolatry, and a hacham is not a gadol, right? You can tell. This is, the question is, how do we distinguish between these things that I'm objecting to here, right, and maintain our respect for the true hachamim? Like a hacham, the way you can tell them apart is by transparency and by power structures, right? If something looks like the medieval church, it's not what we're trying to do here, right? If somebody knows their stuff and they can tell you how they came to their conclusion, and you like their reasoning, and their reasoning is transparent, that is a different thing.
We see this in the Gemara, all over the place. Anytime there's a statement made, the rabbis would want him to what's the word? Would want to qualify statements. Where was the Masorah from? Where did you get it? They had to. It wasn't just like, I say this, boom. There was always, they wanted to know who was the person, who was the teacher you heard it from, and has to track it back. There's a very systematic atmosphere to the Talmud and to the way that the sages went about their conclusions. It wasn't just, And
here the question is going to come, obviously naturally for people, is like, okay, so where does this kind of kabbalistic tradition come from? Meaning where because if there's Masorah, they obviously are tracing it back to something. What is the earliest kind of the first, let's say, rabbi who introduced these ideas? And we see obviously the Franco-German rabbis, the Rishonim, who introduced these ideas. Like what is their Masorah, and how is it different than, let's say, the Rambam's Masorah?
Okay, so you've alluded to it earlier. It's coming through the Provençal schools, the schools that produce the Bahir, for example, right? If you think about the geography of this, when people talk about, so this is where I guess it comes down to this idea of people talk about being Sephardi, right, or Sfarad. When people say Sepharad, right, what that really means is the bit of because Spain was not a unified country, right? There was no such thing as Spain. There were different kingdoms within Spain, and there were kingdoms in Spain. There were areas of Spain that were under Islamic rule, where people spoke Arabic, and there were areas of Spain where people spoke Romance and the languages which turned into Castilian, Catalan, and Languedoc, and all these things. And these were Christian kingdoms, and largely speaking, Kabbalah came through the Christian kingdoms, right? So the major Kabbalists were centered around Girona, right? Girona, the school of the Ramban.
Catalonia, right?
Catalonia, and which is not strictly speaking Spain even now. It's far more French when you go there. Catalan is a different language. It's far closer to French, right? But this is a Christian part of the country, but it's not it's in Old Sepharad, properly speaking, this is an Islamic context. It's Arabic speaking. It's further south, and it's far closer. There is a connection between that culture, which is originally Umayyad culture, which has come from the Middle East, and the people who are still back there, who at that time are the Goanim, right? It's a very different. When people talk, people are not careful enough about how they say this about referring to things as being Sephardi, right? Because it's not. You can get in. That's another whole other argument, but
Right.
The Franco-German pietism that comes through Provence and Catalonia that's the sort of where that comes from, right? And it is very different from where what is going on in Cordoba and the areas that the Rambam is from, and actually, and also people like Ibn Ezra. They're from they're from that tradition. They're not from the northern tradition. So yeah.
And many people make a mistake and they think that the Rambam was kind of like a lone voice or a dat yachid, but in reality, or as you were just mentioning, especially in Andalusia, it's almost every single person. Nobody had such a tradition. Nobody. You might hear elements like in the Kuzari, maybe not kabbalistical per se, but maybe things that you can maybe associate if you use your imagination. But in terms of a kabbalistic tradition, that there was nothing in Spain. Nothing.
And
which is peculiar. It's very peculiar. How can it be that a tradition that is supposedly goes all the way back has absolutely no
influence,
or it's not spotted anywhere in Spain?
And then even when you see peculiar. Like the obviously the Andalusian tradition, it's connected to the Gaonic tradition. With the Gaonim, you have like the head of the academy, Sadia Gaon, rejecting with very harsh words that any kind of idea like reincarnation, right, as something that is not a Jewish idea and all that. This is the head of the academy, and then you have later on, obviously with the Ari, there's this is a secret tradition that only he can know through the revelations of an angel, and that again, that's another issue.
These are red flags.
Those are red flags, and these ideas kind of just come through, and then what happens is that you'll have like a famous like Hasidic Rebbe who says, "I'm the Gilgul of Sadia Gaon, correcting the issue of the Baal Tanya."
Baal Shem Tov.
Baal Shem Tov. So you're correcting Sadia Gaon's mistake by saying that there's no such thing as reincarnation. It's just like there's this like what is it called? Replacement theology going on.
Yeah. And once you have like a theory of transmigration of souls that takes place, you can pretty much make anything else. You get this idea of almost sort of granular correspondence of just vast amounts of different things that can be harmonized with each other. Everything becomes a symbol of something else, right?
Well,
and actually, if you're for those who have the patience, I would recommend Umberto Eco's book, Foucault's Pendulum, where he basically shows like how this whole, what starts off as quite a basic idea starts to like descend. Once you deconstruct it fragments into vast amounts of little splintery groups, each of whom is saying, "Oh, mine is the true secret tradition," but they're all different. And this is something really that happens actually after the wars of religion in the sort of 17th, 18th centuries, right? Everywhere in Europe, people have got their own little group of something that's doing something else, right? And some of these some of these like teachers of righteousness, once they've got these sort of like amazing power, they can do all sorts of crazy things, right? And some of them are very amusing, actually. Once you start looking at what happens in in England, you have people like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley and all that. And you go and look at all the things that sort of came out there. It's quite good fun. I mean, I spent a lot of time talking to people in occultist circles when back in the day, and they have no difficulty whatsoever in drawing on Kabbalah in the same way that they have no difficulty drawing on what they refer to as Egyptian god forms, right? Or Enochian magic, or all sorts of things. And it's also like
Crowley, right? Yeah. Kind of was the predecessor for the Church of Satan. And
well, the Church of Satan, that's Howard Levy, right?
Yes.
Sorry, I should have said
Anton LaVey. Anton LaVey.
Yes, his real name is Howard Levy. And
no, that's not a Jew. He wasn't.
Yeah, of course he's Jewish.
He is? Oh God.
Yeah. Yeah. But now he's actually quite a fun guy, because he's definitely in there to like have a bit of a laugh, right? And do what he likes, right? He is having fun. A lot of these guys are actually just having a bit of fun with it, right? Yeah. The trouble is when you get people who get into they get into something that's quite fun, and then it turns out that it's actually quite a serious business, that people really seriously believe this stuff when you get down to it. So a really good example of this, you've got the theosophical schools who in Russia. Right, so this is like Madame Blavatsky, if you come across her. She's bringing a lot of sort of Hindu thinking, but what she actually ends up doing, those guys end up adopting the protocols. Right, you've got the Thule Society in Germany, and they're coming out of Rosicrucianism and anthroposophy. So this is Rudolf Steiner. There's Steiner schools now even. So this is a German school which believes that we are spiritual beings in the universe. But the other people in those circles are the Thule Society, which includes Guido von List, who is the founder of the Nazis. I mean, it is amazing where these threads will take you. And that for me is the real problem.
Hitler was actually a big believer in the occult.
Well, yeah. And I'm not one of these people who goes, oh, you've therefore got to watch out for occultism, right? What I'm saying is the problem is when you have a leader of your group that is telling you the secret truth that only he or she knows, and it's usually he, right? Yeah. Then there's immense power to be had. This for me is the way that the Church of Scientology was designed. It was designed specifically to tap into these.
Well, Mormonism has the same origin, and the thing is, the Torah really it's unique because it's the only religion to make a claim of mass revelation. But the fundamental teachings of Judaism is that we are always forced to kind of like think about things and ask questions, and we teach our children to question things and to use our brains, right? That's the one tool that God gave us, the Telem Elohim, right? It's the one thing that makes us human and not animals. So we're not supposed to shut that off.
Yeah, I mean, what I would actually go a little bit further than that. Remember these kind of like secret societies and mystical schools of secret adepts, they don't scale, right? The problem is you can't build a society out of this that is sustainable in the long term. This is, by the way, should be a really big red flag for us, right? What we're supposed to be doing here is building a model of something that can actually be implemented in reality with a sustainable society. Right, that's what Chachamim are there to do. They're there to help us, there to help us build a horizontal, if you like, or sort of Torah-based society. Now, I'm not a fan of somebody like Hizb ut-Tahrir, like the sort of Islamist group, right? But they do say one thing that I really like, which is the Quran is our constitution. Now, that's really interesting. Now, obviously, in their arrangement, they've got a Gadol. Right, they've got the Khalifa, and that's the person who's got unchallenged legislative, judicial, and executive supremacy. Now, we have a very different arrangement in the Hebrew polity, right? We have a separation of powers, right? If Torah is the law or constitution of Israel, right? We have separate institutions that deal with the politics, the judiciary, and, if you like, the ecclesiastical priestly areas, right? The monarch is limited by the law. The monarch is under the law. The monarch does not make the law. The monarch isn't the law.
The
right?
Torah makes a point that the kings, sinned.
And they can lose their power.
Yeah, lose their power.
And then he has to carry around a Torah with him all day, all the time, to make this point. You've got to have a Torah with you. You're not able to do what you like, right? This is the difference between Abraham and Nimrod, right? We all covenant into this as part of the that's what we sign up to at Har Sinai, right? We sign up to it. We then get presented later on the small print at the dedication of the Mishkan, right? And there's no thunder and lightning then, right? We've actually got it out in front of us. What we're ratifying is the law. The law is what's at the middle of in the middle of the Mishkan. That's what's inside the Aron, right? The pillar of fire is out front, right? It's the law that's in the middle. The holy is determined by where the law is kept, right? That's what we call, that area in both the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash. The holy is a place, right? Even God is bound by the law, right? God contracts into the law, right? It's very different, right? We have that individual subsidiarity, right? We're not supposed to be subject to the caprice of human tyrants, and that's what we subject ourselves to if we put infallible hero sages in charge of us, right? Public property belongs to society. It doesn't belong to the king, right? The public treasury is entrusted to God through the Kohanim, not the monarchy, right? God apportions the land, right? This is why we have this is why the thing
balance of power. There's a balance of power.
The three crowns.
And not one of those groups can kind of usurp the other's power, and they can also lose their power if they violate the law. We see actually America is based on that, was built to be based on that model, where there's this idea of breaking away from the monarchy, breaking away from the church, and kind of making the Constitution kind of like a version of the Torah in a way, and that no one is above the law. Where all men are created equal. This idea was firmly based on Judaism.
Yeah,
and against the British model, by the way, which I can tell you, the way that happens when you promulgate a law in the UK, right? The way that happens is the law is presented to Parliament as the wish of the king in Norman French. Le roi le veut. The king wills it, and the king's word is the law. Now, in reality, the king is constitutionally limited. We had a civil war about that, but we still make like it's the king that makes the law. Still, the king and the royal family are still not subject to the law in many ways unless they agree to be it. So that is a big difference between and America was partly founded upon not being like the British for this very same reason. Everything's the Keter Malchut is supposed to be constitutionally limited. The Keter Kahuna is constitutionally limited. This is why there was a problem when the Hasmoneans took the Keter Malchut. It violated the separation of powers.
Hashmonaim. Okay.
Yeah, Hashmonaim. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The priests, have to follow a prescribed method. Otherwise, right, Nadav and Avihu, right? And all of it comes under the Keter Shem Tov. The community has to consent to it. Now, where is that under our current in the current state of the Jewish people? We don't have that, right? It's not. I'm going to be a bit Michael Palin here. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from a magical concept of dust Torah and infallible saintly autocrats, right? There is, we need to have that back. If we don't have that, we're just dependent on the whims.
That's the answer to those who say who are you to question, this gadol? Are you as good as him? I'm saying no, it's not what I'm saying. I could point to the Gaonim, I could point to Tanaim, I could point to the Torah and say the burden of proof is on him. I don't need to prove myself. He has to prove himself against what he's saying, because it seems
he's
to
making a claim that's outside the boundary of what the Torah in its plain sense presents to us.
Yeah, and this is why the Rambam would argue with the Gaonim, even when the Gaonim sit in the chair of the Gaonim. It's like, well, so what if you do sit in the chair of the Gaonim, right? That doesn't make you the boss of everyone, right? Who's right is who's right.
Nachman Delus had no problem arguing with the Gaonim, but and the Gaonim would have wanted it that way. That's the point, because it's not about infallibility, or if there were certain things that they thought that the Gaonim got wrong, they wouldn't be shy away from saying it. That's it. And that's how a healthy society should present itself.
Yeah. And for me, this is why you have to understand the structures that have undermined this, which are kabbalistic in practice, right? But worse than being kabbalistic, they're fundamentally based on sort of neo-Platonic and Gnostic ideas, right? These are the ideas that have hollowed out our polity as a people, and have given us this kind of strange recreation of medieval Catholicism, complete with scholastics and heretics and papal wars and what are the guys I'm thinking of? Kupat Ha'ir. Right, and get this magical spoon which has been blessed by Rav Kanievsky. I mean, God, really?
Yeah, well, get ready to be in the camp of the heretics, I guess. You're not allowed to speak about these things. But the thing is, we know both of us know many rabbis who would love to talk about what we're talking about, but we're not wearing those hats, and we can kind of get a lot more than what they can get away with, because their careers would be at stake. And so many rabbis know this, and they talk about it in private, but they just it's career suicide to kind of bring up these points.
But isn't that how Kabbalah started to begin with? People were it grew a life of its own, and the rabbis got kind of timid about speaking about it back then, and then it sort of kind of got ingrained into society that way.
Yeah, it was timid. They were timid because it was often met with violence.
With violence and resistance, it's a problem. Yeah.
And it was an incredibly powerful way of actually getting people to do the right things. Right, if you could scare people, it was one thing going, you got to listen to the local rav and the local Beit Din, they made the law, and people go, But if you say, and by the way, he has the secret wisdom, and if you don't do as he says, then you're breaking the universe, right? And so you've all got to keep, so it becomes this marketing tool.
Also, I think one of the most dangerous ideas also that was introduced, which I believe actually led to, the Jewish kind of Enlightenment, where the idea of the soul, the Jewish soul being higher, like this elevated soul, where there's this idea that almost you don't have to kind of perfect yourself through the mitzvot, right? You can kind of circumvent it with this knowledge, right? Because the panimiut is actually
one with God,
right? You just have to understand, if you know the depth, you don't really need the kind of to live a halachic life, and I think that idea led to, like, you have a high soul. This idea of you have a high soul is very problematic. It's not a Jewish concept. I don't know if you can elaborate, or you have anything to say about that.
I don't know. I think you've laid it out really well. I mean, I don't want to have a particular pop at Hasidut on this, but a lot of it is that kind of rebellion against the idea that it's the simple faith, right? What do they call it? Pushta yid, right? That sort of thing. Yeah. So that simple faith is what you really need. You don't need the sort of corruption of these like important guys that hang out with the noblemen in the castle and lend money at court, right? You want simple faith, the faith that gets you through the week, that so you can have your Shabbat, and your simple Shabbat is more important than any of these things, because you actually, by the way, that's powered by the power of the universe in a way that this other stuff really isn't. And yeah, I have to say, when you look at, and this is one of the things that, so what I would sorry, I'm going to start again. What I would say about this is that what is being replicated here is a set of very similar things that happened in medieval Christianity, right? People looked at the church and they looked at the riches and the corruption, right? And the sort of compromises that they'd made. And they said, what we really want is, simplicity, right? This is where the Franciscans came from, like feed the poor, give charity, all of these things, easy to understand. And it gives you this sort of like the level of sanctity and simplicity. Now, on one level, who could object to that, right? Who wouldn't want to feed the poor? Who wouldn't want to live a more simple life? But when you do that and you move over to this idea of what's really important is like you said, Fancy Pinimut, right? Mm-hmm. What's important is what goes on inside. Well, that's the same argument that Savonarola used, right? Yeah. Never mind all that art. Burn the art. You don't need the art. Oh, and by the way, burn the people, because because we're really interested in people's souls. And if you're not sinning with your body, right, then your soul is free to like do something more important.
Yeah, I mean that kind of, you mentioned the Dominican friar Savonarola. You even go back to the Rabbeinu Yonah controversy, where he has the Rambam's books burned, and then all of a sudden he sees what it leads to, because now you opened up Pandora's box. Now they're starting to burn Talmud. And now they're turning their eyes on the Jews. They're saying, there's rebels, over here. There are people who are undermining. There's, and that whole approach of like suppressing and kind of even like, people who want to see this show that we're having open conversations. There's always this force, this violent force that's kind of coming and trying to suppress ideas and conversations, and it's been happening for 1,000 years.
And by the way, this is this one of the ways in which this manifests is in people trying to avoid talking about things that show the community in a bad light. On one hand, right, I totally agree with you about like it's a really bad precedent to report for the secular authorities to start getting the idea that burning Jewish books is a good idea. Right, that's a really bad idea. You can of worms right open. Now the trouble is there are some people that will make the same argument for saying, oh, even if people are being denied an education and people are being abused by rabbis and etc., and there's financial crime, you shouldn't report it, Misirah, and we shouldn't talk about these things because it's gonna open that can of worms, and this is how the Talmud ended up being burned. And I kind of go, really? Is that really where you're going to go with that? I mean, do we not have a responsibility within our own community to actually challenge these ideas, right? And if people aren't doing that, then, and even worse, if they're not doing it because they're afraid that it'll affect their professional standing and their parnassah and the marriage prospects of their children, right? That's also a problem. We should be actually really questioning what we've allowed the community to become, right? Why would we? Who benefits from this, right? Because there's a bunch of people who are right. There's a bunch of people who are really being harmed by it, right? There's a bunch of people who are being forced to live in poverty. There's a bunch of people who are subject to the most extreme totalitarian sort of practices, like within our community, that have no comeback. And by the way, there's a bunch of people who are donating money to those community institutions, right, and helping, and they're not. and they don't understand what it is they're enabling.
So
yeah.
This will actually lead to the final part where I want to discuss, your organization and what you, because you obviously fight against fundamentalism. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Thank you. So, so I guess first of all, what I've been talking about here is really about my sort of personal views, and as a observant, a person who tries to be Shomer Maswath, a person who lives in the modern world, somebody who doesn't see that there's a contradiction between Torah and Chokhmah, right? I mean, I would consider that a sort of classical Sephardi approach, right?
Absolutely.
But I live in the real world, but I also live in the Jewish community, and my family lives in that community. My friends are in that community, and the things that have annoyed me and have really made me very angry about the way that people in power behave come from this lack of accountability and transparency, and the lack of ability for people to take responsibility for the abuse of power, right? It is most egregious in the community where you have people who are able to exercise levers like Das Torah, right? And people who are able to say, if you don't espouse if you don't wear the correct thickness of tights, if you don't if you are seen in public with a smartphone, if you are, if you don't sign up to this massive book of modesty regulations, then you are going to be in trouble, right? And nowhere else in society are people permitted to behave like this, right? And I became very concerned, particularly at the way people would use Torah to sort of justify the abuse of power. And I first got involved with that really dealing with people that I would consider to be like preachers, so the likes of Yosef Mizrahi, right? Now he's like small fry, right? But what he does is, his whole thing is, I'll say the things that everyone else thinks this, but they won't say it in reality. Well, actually, that's not quite true. You go and look at things that he says, right? And everything that he says, and he says this himself, comes from Avigdor Miller. You go and look at how widespread the thinking of Avigdor Miller is in what I would describe as mainstream Orthodox thought and education, and you'll find some really problematic stuff. There's problematic stuff about people who aren't religious. There's problematic stuff about women. There's problematic stuff about Black people, and how slavery did people a favor.
He was
right.
This is true.
Right now, if these were other people saying if people were saying these things about us, right, and when people have said these things about us from other religions, we've got very upset about them. And yet here we are, people in our religion, supposedly saying these things, just behaving like extremists. And the fact is, you have to come to the conclusion that these people are extremists, right? We have our own, usually we are conditioned to think that extremism is about violence, right? And that someone's got to be blown or stabbed or shot for it to be extremism. Well, that's not true, right? People can be, if you are kept in poverty, if you are prevented from marrying who you want to marry, if you are forced to marry someone you don't want to marry, if you are unable to earn a living because you haven't been allowed to get an education, right? If you don't have choice about leaving, right? All of these things are coercive control, right? When these things went on in South Asian communities in the UK, people did something about it, right? And it's about time we started doing these sorts of things. We started actually thinking about these things ourselves, right? Because, so I guess the point is, I became very concerned with this. There are a lot of other fellow travelers campaigning on different issues, and we brought this together into an organization called Nahamu. And this is an organization that now campaigns on campaigns on these issues. We particularly campaign around autonomy and freedom of choice, right? And the thing that I think is really important to emphasize here is that this is not anti-Torah, right? It's not anti-Torah for people to be able to choose stuff, right? Surely we believe that Torah is something that people would choose of their own free will, right? People would choose to keep Torah. It's a good option, right? I believe that. And people should be, but people should be given that choice. You can't compel people in this way. Not without causing some very unpleasant outcomes. When it's combined with,
without choice, there's no meaning to anything you're doing.
Yeah.
Choice is what makes everything meaningful. Choosing
100%.
to do it is what makes it worthwhile. If you're just doing it because you're conditioned or in a sense forced from to live a certain way, it doesn't really have much meaning. There's nothing to it then.
Yeah, and we see the after effects of this way of thinking. Like the example is the Haredi community. There's so many, even in the Baal Tshuva Haredi community, there's so many kids that we see that are going off the derech, right, so to speak. And I have relatives also that same thing happens, because they're kind of brought up in an environment of fear.
Yeah, it's not
but look at the language here, right? Off the derech, like there's one derech.
Right.
True.
Right.
Yeah.
True. You're right.
Yeah.
Where's the choice? Where are the Shivim Panim LeTorah, right? Then there's got to be more than one way to do things.
So this leads us to the last point we want to make is, what is your case for Maimonidean thinking? This classical Sephardic approach. I hate all these terms. They're not the most precise terms, but what would you say is, like, if you have to pitch it, how is this the best alternative for living a good Jewish life of observance of mitzvot and living a balanced life?
I would say it's the focusing on monotheism as the sort of central organizing principle is not something that will send you wrong, right? Focusing on monotheism enables you to base what you do on a robust philosophical principle, right? Also, the idea of philosophical inquiry as a necessary part of having a robust mental intellectual structure, right? It's going to prevent you falling into, well, it's not going to prevent, but it's going to minimize the chance of you falling into an error and staying into an error, because you're going to be constantly questioning, right? The thing I like about it is that it makes people radically accountable, right? You are accountable as a covenanted Israelite under the law, right? These are your obligations. You fulfill them or you don't fulfill them, right? You're not going to get hit with a magical hammer from Shemayim, right? If you do these things wrong, you're not going to break the universe, but you will, but you have not done what you said you would do, right? You committed, right? And you were grandfathered into this covenant, into this deal, right? And you have obligations, just like you have obligations to pay your taxes. You've got to do these things, right? You don't do them, right? You might get away with it, right? And you can be like guilt tripped into, all sorts of things, but it's not as good as doing it yourself. Not as good as understanding why you're doing things and actually understanding the structure that you work within. The second part is really about sustainability. linking the objectives of living according to Torah and Swath is about preparing to be part, or to making this society come into existence in reality. That's what we want to do, right? If what you want to do is create this sort of like international club of like mystic hippies or whatever it is, and everyone's going to be like selling their, everyone's only worried about what happens when they die, or what happens in the higher worlds, or what happens here, or that's just as bad as everyone worried about, that are they wearing the latest clothes, or are they wearing the right type of hat, right? Or, it's not human-centered. You're thinking about something else, right? The Maimonidean approach for me is about, let's focus on the actual, what matters, what's written down, what's demonstrable, right? And things that can be properly understood. It does not rely on you having to trust some magic authority figure. And that for me is the really big difference, right?
Yeah. What people will mistakenly say is that, oh, but you're treating the Rambam like this. But the truth is, he's just a symbol of this kind of free thinking within Judaism, where we are not. He would be rolling in his grave, so to speak, if we visited his kever and prayed over there. Like, it's like,
yeah, there's a statue of him in Cordoba. I mean, that would make him incandescent, right? And and this is the thing. I also, one of the things he says is, you should accept the truth from wherever you find it, right? Now that means that when he has when he brings in science, he's bringing in the best available science, right? And he's saying, if it's a scientific thing, you go on what's right, right? Just like the sages did when they consult an expert. If you've got a technical question to do with sheep, go and ask a shepherd, right? Because they know best, right? And when he's bringing in things that actually later on turn out to be wrong, like in the Shabbetai Ẓevi, where he's talking about the spheres, and he's using Ptolemaic cosmology, that's because that's the best available scientific thinking, right? And I don't think it's a big stretch to say he would go with what's the best available thinking is on things that can be demonstrated. In the same way that you accept the truth from whoever says it, you should reject falsehood from whoever says it as well. And that for me is the difference. Beautiful. Right? But that's going to mean knocking some very big idols off their pedestals, in my opinion.
It's amazing, because when we look at the Torah, something that we read it every year and everyone knows about it, but when you really think about it and what the Torah might be communicating to us, the fact that the Torah has a whole sequence of Moshe Rabbeinu sinning, Moshe Rabbeinu making a huge mistake, a mistake that didn't allow him to enter the land after everything that he did, is extremely eye-opening when you think about it. It's almost like the Torah is communicating to you, even the greatest Jew that ever lived, or at least the greatest prophet that ever lived, right? That communicated to us, the absolute laws of the Torah, made a huge mistake. That's incredible when we think about it, and that should really be like
accountability,
a template.
Accountability. Yeah, and he is accountable. He has to take the consequences of his mistakes.
He did. He was accountable, and that's really a template. If you think about it, if Moshe Rabbeinu can be wrong, can do wrong, be wrong, then how can you put it onto anyone to be?
We even see with our kings, the greatest of kings, David. Is probably the most famous story about him is his sin with Bathsheba, and he commits one of the most vile kind of acts, and he is fully accountable. I mean, no other king in the ancient world would allow someone to come and you see this he says Chatati, but Natan HaNavi is basically rebuking him, and no one's around. He could just kill him and just silence him, But that to me is the most amazing thing, because you won't see that with King Henry VIII. You won't see that with anybody else who was in power. He had the opportunity to just keep doubling down and just covering up and covering up and covering up. But as a leader, the reason why we study this, the reason why the Torah doesn't hide the sins of our great leaders is because that's what makes them human. It's their ability to kind of accept responsibility when they make mistakes, because we are all going to make mistakes. Human beings are flawed. We're going to make mistakes, and that's the beauty. This idea of, you know, turning everyone into a tzaddik that never sins and all that, it's extremely counterproductive, extremely, you know, an anathema to the Torah. The Torah is going out of its way to tell us that they made mistakes.
Yes.
Yeah. So next time you see somebody tells you one of these, someone hands you one of these biographies of some Gadolatry, which tells you all about how he did miracles when he was little and how he never did anything at any time that wasn't like learning Torah, right? And you're going, okay, sure. Or anybody tells you this, gives you one of these stories where they go, and it turns out that this guy, and you'll never guess what happened. It turned out that when he got back, the thing that the rabbi told him was absolutely true, and oh my God, right? And we're mythologizing these people. It's like we're mythologizing. This process is going on right now with people like Rav Moshe Feinstein, right? I think I heard quite. I don't know if this is true. I once heard an anecdote about him where he was sort of like looking at. He was at a simcha. He was making a cup of tea for himself. He pours. You know, he looks at the cup. He looks at some milk. He puts it down. Someone looks at it, goes to him and goes, "Rabbi, what was wrong with the milk? Was the hechsher not right? Was it not Chalav Yisrael?" He's like, "No, it was off." Right? It's like, can we just calm down? Yeah. Stop treating these guys like they're like, you know.
And the truth is, someone like Rav Moshe Feinstein was a real Talmid Chacham who wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want this. This is not what.
Yeah. I had the same thing about this. I think this is about Rav Soloveitchik. And someone asked him for a bracha. He goes, "Why? Are you a vegetable?" Again, I don't know if this is true, but you know, people say this.
This is amazing, though.
Yeah. Well, this was really a lot of fun and very informative, and we hope to do this again. Thank you so much for.
We really appreciate it. We appreciate your time, your
and taking the risks. You know, putting this out there. It's not easy. You know, we all have families and
for your organization, which is extremely impressive and important.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Well, we're trying to do some good stuff. And
what was the name of it?
No matter what you hear, we want Jews to be able to live as Jews. We want Jews to keep Torah. You know, that is these things are important, but we want people to choose.
Amen. And what was the name of the organization again? You said
Nachamu.
All right. Thank you. God bless, and we'll be in touch.
And Shavua Tov.